In my review of White Paper Games' journalist sim The Occupation, I said that the game doesn't manage to live up to its own lofty expectations. It's an idea that I want to explore a little more with you lot in this video, going through a couple of things that the game does very, very well, and then explaining how, mostly, The Occupation manages to ruin these same traits thanks to frustrating gameplay, before giving a verdict on whether or not it's a good game. I won't be going into any spoilers here, but if you don't want to know anything before playing the game, go away now and come back later. Right, let's get to it. The gimmick of The Occupation is that all the investigating you do is done in real time. Before you get the chance to interview one of the game's three main subjects, you'll have 1 hour of real time to run around like a headless chicken, trying to track down clues or follow up on leads that give you a bit of ammunition when it comes to those interviews. The great thing about the investigation system in the game is that there are so many leads for you to chase that a big part of the game is managing your workload. Sacrifice is a natural part of this, and you'll quickly have to get used to letting one piping hot lead get away from you in favour of another, lest you turn up to the interview with nothing more than a pocket full of dreams. It's a feature that works incredibly well for The Occupation, putting a real emphasis on you making the most of your time and figuring out which leads will best serve you. Of course, those leads that you forego the first time also mean that there's plenty of reasons to play through The Occupation a second, third, or even fourth time to make the most of all the clues you have. As you might expect, getting your hands on the spicy information you'll need to leave an impression during the interview will mean that you're going to have to make your way into some areas that are strictly off limits. This isn't too bad for the most part though, with the majority of rooms having ventilation systems that your journalists can die-hard their way through, or else nabbing an ID card that you'll find for much needed entry into rooms brimming with hot gossip for your story. Of course, as you're not supposed to be there, the game is obliged to put up some resistance to your presence, and it does this through Steve the security guard. Steve is a bastard. To be fair, Steve isn't a real issue because he's terrible at his job. Being an easily bored and aspiring actor, Steve is more of a lovable doofus, one who's terrible at accents if his audition tapes are anything to go by. Unfortunately for you, when Steve does spot you during one of his meaningless patrols, he quickly becomes something of a bloodhound, ceaselessly walking after you until he escorts you away to the security office where you get a bit of a telling off. It's not that the system is too difficult, you'll often forget that there's a guard to even look out for thanks to Steve's terrible attitude to his work. The issue is that the stealth in The Occupation doesn't really work. Instead it feels like it was jammed in there at the last minute. There's no real rhyme or reason to Steve spotting you, while trying to get to grips with his movements at times feels almost counterintuitive to your work, as Steve will just stand there unmoving until he somehow spots you again. It's jarring to see yet another game feel obliged to jam a stealth feature in without really taking the time to develop it fully, and it's something that manages to dampen so much of the fun that the investigation section creates, not because of challenge, but because it simply doesn't work well. You'd expect a game about the painstaking work that goes into a piece of journalism to be pretty compelling, but The Occupation takes it to a whole other level. Placing you in alternate Britain during the 80s, you play as the high-flying journo called Harvey Miller, brought in to get the story on Alex Dubois, an immigrant accused of a terrorist act that's pushed the country down a path of anti-immigration rhetoric, paving the way for a controversial Big Brother-esque Union Act. It's a plot that makes the gameplay of The Occupation feel weighty and meaningful, with the actions you take having noticeable effects on how the story plays out. Add to that a world where the growing tension is palpable, manifested in the distant roars of protesters and hate speech spray painted on walls, and it shows just how much thought has gone into The Occupation. There's a sentiment that games aren't equipped to handle meaty topics like politics. It's an idea I've never really agreed with, and The Occupation is the latest example that shows how the medium has matured enough to be able to tackle such challenging conversations well. Unfortunately for The Occupation, so much of the work that the game does in ramping up tension, especially during latter parts of the game, is slowly but most assuredly undone by the game's distinct lack of direction at pivotal moments. It's a simple thing, with so much of the game's plot-specific scenes that are supposed to be the culminations of everything you work towards, being deflated into irritating, panicked runs around basements and offices as you try to find something you didn't even know you needed. All the while the story sits there, waiting to be triggered as all of its intrigue seeps away until it's nothing more than something marred by your own frustration and confusion thanks to not knowing what to do. The good news is that a lot of this can be fixed pretty easily. The game's objectives are listed on a clipboard, but generally look like an absolute state for the most part. If the developer streamlined these objectives a bit more, making clear what your utmost priority should be, or just putting a single objective on the game's UI when you only have one thing to do, then it'd save so much of these story moments from being lost to frustration. I want to end on something that the game does incredibly well throughout though, that being the voice acting. The entirety of The Occupation treats you to some absolutely stellar performances, with the entire cast managing to put in shifts that manage to do so much legwork in, dare I say it, immersing you into that world. Though I feel it necessary to call out Amelia Tyler for her role as Scarlet. There are moments in The Occupation where you'll play as this other character, who lost her husband in the bombing that set off the events of the game. These monologues in particular are such standout segments of the game, as you walk through the twisting paths on your way home, or through the debris of the bombing, as Scarlet's wistful runaway thoughts underline the scathing grief that she's still going through. And while Tyler's performance is a standout one, the entire cast of The Occupation put in a real shift, something that very few games can say. Well done with that, White Paper Games. Despite the lackluster stealth system that doesn't really work, and the way the game manages to get in its own way during key story moments, The Occupation does so much in its premise, plot and the world that is still well worth your time. Hopefully, the issues that I spoke about here will be ironed out by the developer at some point. Until then, The Occupation is a great idea executed in a very mediocre way.